Okay, well, we've looked at behavioural imitation and how that informs us, and we've looked at physiological synchrony and how that informs us. But the next question is obviously, what are we sensing from other people? And to answer this, we've really got to come to grips with the fact that detecting signals, sensing something and perceiving something are very different things. So for example, here I've got what's called a Geiger counter. It's a sensor that detects radiation, and every time it picks up a bit of radiation, it makes a blipping noise. Now that sensor is detecting radiation, but it's not perceiving radiation. It's the human being, the consciousness that perceives, and perception is a property of consciousness. Only conscious beings behold. So we're getting away from the idea that we detect everything that is out there as if we're a Geiger counter registering all the signals that come in. Now, the other thing we want to get away from is the idea that we have 5 senses. This is completely outdated. We've got at least 22. Nobody knows exactly how many. Most of them are on the inside. We're still describing ourselves as having 5 on the outside, but even that is out of date. Now, what we need to take on board in order to understand somatic empathy is that these senses don't run in a linear fashion. So we don't go from light hitting the back of the eyeball to going to the brain to seeing that object. That's far from what's going on. Now, all our different senses are cross-referenced naturally. So in this experiment here, we've got this man eating crisps. There's a lovely experiment to show that there's cross-referencing between the 2 senses of seeing and hearing. So if you give a group of people a load of fresh crisps and they describe them as crispy, and then you give them a bunch of stale crisps and they describe them as soggy and stale. But then you give them the same stale, soggy crisp, but you play crunching noises in the background, and they will then describe the crisps as fresh and crispy. And it's because they've cross-referenced the crunching sound. It's kind of overridden their obviously lower order senses in the mouth. And all our senses cross-reference like this, and this is not synesthesia. This is not a medical disorder. Synesthesia is a medical condition that's got quite repeatable cross-referencing of specific senses that are abnormal. With the normal cross-referencing goes on all the time. So if you can imagine the combined, collated information from 22 different senses, you start to get an idea of the complexity of the information we're getting about another person. So another example of how our senses are cross-referenced. A team of linguistic researchers in the University of Columbia have discovered that we use input from our skin, not just our ears, when we're trying to understand speech. By putting little puffs of air on people's skin, it influenced their comprehension of words being spoken. Fascinating, and they've come up with an idea that it's to do with the fact that we aspirate as we speak. So sometimes we're projecting air forward, and particular sounds, sharp sounds, have particular aspirations, and that we're using the information from the air flowing on our skin to comprehend the words. Absolutely fascinating. Now, one of the biggest problems we've got in science, it's so big it's called the hard problem, is explaining consciousness. It remains an enigma. Nobody can explain how it works. And basically we've got a dark box inside our skull, and how that dark box beholds even just one thing like light is completely beyond science at the moment. So we're dealing with something like when we're talking about perception, we're dealing with an area that is murky for scientific evidence, to say the least. But there are lots of cognitive scientists working on consciousness, what it is, trying to pick apart the rules by which it works. And they're all coming up with the same conclusion, that, you know, reality doesn't exist the way we think it does. So colour, for example, we might all agree that an object is red or blue or yellow, but it doesn't exist in reality. It's a construct of our brain. The experience of colour is an internal experience, and it does not exist independent of our perception of it. And perception is also shaped by our history, by our past perceptions. So here we've got a picture of a snake. So let's say we've got two hikers walking along, and the hiker sees a rope coiled up in the grass and does not react. The other hiker leaps in the air because he has perceived it as a snake. And the reason is that in the past he was had a nasty experience with a snake. So his past has changed his perception of the coiled rope in the grass and made him highly likely to perceive it as a snake coiled up that is a threat. And neuroscientists have found out that we're more influenced by our past than what is actually coming into our sensory receptors at any one time. So with the coiled rope example, the information going into the eyes is exactly the same for the two people, for the two hikers, but one of them is seeing a snake and the other one is seeing a rope, because they're more influenced by their history, by their past experience, than by what's actually going in their eyes. Now, perception is also somatosensory. We perceive with our body as well as our brain. We feel perceptions. So what do I mean by that? If you read in a book a description that someone has a gravelly voice, as you're reading that, the part of your brain that would enable you to feel the texture, gravel, with your fingers, that part of your brain is activated. That's how you recognize the word gravelly, is that you're activating that feeling of touching gravel. So even interpreting words is a somatosensory experience. So the philosopher Alvarno is concluding in his incredibly complex book, Action in Perception, that perception is not something that happens to us or in us, like it's not something that happens in your brain. It's something we do. So it has this embodied property. So in conclusion, we are not sensing people the way a Geiger counter is detecting radiation. So there's no point saying, how do I pick up that this person has a headache? What am I picking up that this person has a headache? I'm not going to be able to give you a linear diagram of one sensory receptor and a nerve pathway going to a part of the brain. What we're doing is we're constructing perceptions about other people, and those will be based on the collation of all our sensory inputs. And it will be subjective because it's based on our past experience and our expectations. So we'll leave that there for now.